Mount Everest, the name of this mountain beast, conjures up stories and pictures from its brief but fascinating and frequently contentious past. The story of Changma is full of mystery and intrigue, spanning from the magnificent first ascent of Sir Edmund Hillary and Tenzing Norgay to the tragic ends experienced by many who attempted to ascend the planet's highest peak. This massive mountain has not only drawn some of the most crazy, passionate, and fearless explorers the world has ever seen, but has also been the site of some of the most bizarre, unexplained, and eerie occurrences in the history of climbing. Which of the mountain's greatest mysteries remains the most puzzling and unexplained? Come along as we explore a startling new discovery made by scientists on Mount Everest that changes everything. The Maurice Wilson tale adventure comics from the 1930s, which often featured the incredible daring exploits of pioneering individuals, might have inspired the plot of Maurice Wilson Ace Drummond, an aviator who swooped down on global hotspots to vanquish desperados. One such figure, regrettably fictional, was created by Eddie Rickenbacker and made his journalistic debut in 1933. Maurice Wilson, born in Bradford on the 21st of April, 1898, enlisted as a commissioned lieutenant in 1916 and participated in the terrible Battle of Passchendaele with the West Riding Regiment. He was decorated with the Military Cross for his valiant deeds as a second lieutenant during the Battle of Meteran, where he single-handedly held a machine gun post against a German attack while every other member of his unit had been either killed or wounded. Maurice Wilson's expedition to Mount Everest in 1934 is a remarkable and tragic tale in the history of mountaineering. This man set out on a daring attempt to conquer Mount Everest without any training or expertise. Wilson came up with a novel strategy to climb the peak after being inspired by the failed attempts of Andrew Irvine and George Mallory in 1924. He aimed to land a plane close to Everest and then climb the peak on foot. He bought a de Havilland DH-60 Moth plane called Everest and embarked on his daring journey, despite his lack of flying and mountaineering expertise. While on his voyage, Wilson faced many obstacles. Professionals who thought his strategy would never work were critical of him and his methods. Wilson persisted in the face of warnings and challenges because his faith and determination were unshakable. Wilson spent the winter in daring planning for his ascent. After he survived these obstacles, 3 Sherpas with prior Everest expedition experience were recruited by him. Disguised as Buddhist monks, Wilson and the Sherpas made their way to the Rongbuk Monastery, situated close to Everest. He then began his solo climb of the peak. Nonetheless, Wilson encountered challenging weather conditions, hazardous terrain, and an absence of technical climbing expertise and appropriate gear. Unfortunately, Wilson had to turn back owing to physical constraints and bad weather. Injured and blinded by snow, he limped down to the Rongbuk Monastery. Tragically, his body was discovered the following year by another climber, Eric Shipton, at the foot of the North Colonel. The exact circumstances of Wilson's death remain uncertain, but it is believed to be a result of exhaustion or starvation. Many people are fascinated by the audacity of Wilson's mission and his unfortunate end. The prospect that Wilson may reach the peak and die on the way down has been the subject of much conjecture throughout the years. Nonetheless, the consensus among historians and specialists is that he failed miserably in his endeavor. An account of Wilson's ascent of Everest attests to the enchantment and mercilessness of the highest mountain on Earth. This story will never get old since it chronicles the unstoppable will of the human race to achieve its loftiest goals and break all previous records. Mount Everest's Sleeping Beauty is the tragic backstory of renowned mountaineer Frances Arsentive. Born Frances Yabo on January 18, 1958, in Hawaii, very little is known about her life. Together with her husband, Sergei Arsentive, whom she wed in 1992, she conquered numerous summits. She was the first woman to ski down Mount Elbrus in Russia and some of its east and west peaks. In an effort to break new ground, the pair opted to climb Everest without the use of supplementary oxygen. Frances wasn't exactly the typical climber, not a professional, nor an obsessive adventurer, but the couple was nonetheless up for the challenge. Mount Everest is still no monster to be trifled with carelessly. It has its ways to remind climbers not to be cocky and never to underestimate the power of Mother Nature. In conditions as cold as -160 degrees Fahrenheit, No technological advancement on Earth can rescue someone trapped at an altitude of 29,000 feet. On the eve of the ascent of Mount Everest, the nightmare occurred. Paul begged his mother, Frances, not to go, but she had to do this. Even though Frances wasn't a professional climber, Sergei had quite a bit of expertise and was even called the snow leopard due to his extensive climbing background. Without using any more oxygen, the two did in fact reach the peak of Everest, making Frances the first woman from the US to do so. Reaching base camp after climbing Mount Everest takes about 19 days. It takes over 40 days to climb all the way to the top of Mount Everest from base camp. The descent of the mountain from the peak takes another 30 to 40 days. Therefore, the whole journey can take 3 months or 90 days. The couple had made it to the peak pretty much problem-free. The problems began to surface as they descended. Nobody knows for sure what happened. However, another couple who were making the ascent would later explain to reporters what happened to this pair that fateful day. It was Wood and Kathy who related the story of how they encountered Frances, dressed in her vibrant purple jacket while climbing. When the couple thought Frances was dead, they sank into a reverent silence. However, just as they were about to go on, they saw that Frances was still alive, saying something, and her body was violently spasming. As they got closer, they recognized the woman from base camp. In their eyes, she didn't have much enthusiasm for climbing, she was more concerned with being by her husband's side. Her conversation about her child and life at home was more prevalent. On Everest, the air is 1/3 of the oxygen done at sea level. Frances was now struggling for air, her face was frostbitten, and she wasn't fully conscious. After some time, as she lay frozen in the snow, she resembled a wax figure, she resembled Sleeping Beauty, as the pair would say later. As to the cause of her death, hypothermia was a definite cause, but it is also believed Frances took a fall resulting in a brain injury like cerebral edema. If they had attempted lugging the corpse thousands of feet down to base camp, they would have likely met the same fate as Frances due to the mountain's extreme height. How about her husband? Frances's husband had lost her during the descent. Sergei arrived at camp, but Frances was nowhere to be found. It was suggested that he refrained from returning to camp until she arrived. Accordingly, he waited for quite a while. When he finally had enough of waiting, he went in search of Frances. The whole day he looked, but sadly, he died too on the mountain. He was found a year later. Like Frances, he seems to have fallen and died of hemorrhage. Climbers are reminded that nature has the last word by the sight of the dead lying where they fell on Everest, like macabre markers. Better that you have climbed it previously makes no difference to your level of expertise. The weather determines whether you will reach the summit of Everest on a given day, hour, or even minute. Having been haunted by the thought of abandoning Frances and then having to endure climber images of the woman here for years, a group of people came together to return and give Frances a proper burial. They removed her from the passage, after draping the American flag over her so climbers couldn't find her and couldn't take photos of her anymore. The tale of Sleeping Beauty Everest is famous amongst climbers, but more for cautionary reasons. Inspiring and motivating stories are not necessarily the norm. At other times, their purpose is mainly to issue a warning, and such is the narrative of Frances Arsentive. In her story, we learn that it is possible to achieve your dreams, but that there are perils on the way down Everest. The exact cause of her death will never be revealed with certainty. The causes could be anything from being at a high altitude to being exhausted, injured, or suffering from oxygen deprivation. According to specialists, she could have been able to survive without the use of supplementary oxygen if she had been at a lower elevation. As a cautionary tale for those venturing into dangerously high altitudes without supplemental oxygen, this tale has been passed down through the generations. No one has forgotten Frances's story since it happened. Climbers are now much more cognizant of the risks involved with attempting to scale Major Everest without oxygen. Even the most seasoned climbers are human and can make mistakes. This story and the bodies on Everest serve as a reminder of that. The vanishing snowboarder on Everest is an obscure mystery surrounding the first snowboarder to descend from the peak of the world's most famous mountain, Mount Everest. The mystery concerns a French snowboarder named Marco Siffredi. Marco had already ascended Everest. He was famous for being the first snowboarder to descend many large peaks while wearing his cross. The 29,035-foot mountain was his holy grail of snowboarding, but he had to ride down an alternate way after reaching the peak on May 23, 2001. The coveted Hornby Couloir didn't have enough snow, so he rode down the Norton Couloir for the historic ride back to Advanced Base Camp at the foot of the North Kernel. Apparently, that wasn't enough. After hearing the mountain's repeated calls to return, Siffredi resolved to go in September when Hornby often experiences more snowfall. Therefore, he returned to Everest with his snowboard and attempted to reach the peak once more. After a 12-hour ascent to the peak on September 8, 2002, Siffredi fastened his snowboard to his feet, sought assistance from a reliable Sherpa companion, and began his descent on Hornby. He was never seen again. Does Everest serve as the home of the Yeti? Well, there have been numerous personal and eyewitness accounts. In Charles Howard Berry's book Mount Everest, The Reconnaissance 1921, he reports seeing large footprints in the snow. His Sherpa guides said they belonged to the wild man of the snows. Perhaps the most thrilling supporting evidence is photographs from mountaineer Eric Shipton. The discovery of these enormous footprints in the snow piqued the curiosity of people all over the country in the Yeti. Some people still think the images are the best proof of the Yeti, and the controversy over them continues to this day. Legends about a bipedal, hairy nighttime beast lived among the indigenous Nepali and Tibetan communities in the Everest region, where many of the first reports of the Yeti originated. Modern science has made great strides in supporting the region's storytellers' claims through numerous sightings, footprints, and even DNA evidence. Notable examples include the enormous footprints found at 20,000 feet by Eric Shipton's 1951 Everest expedition and the Yeti scalp contained in Kumjung Monastery on Everest's south side. The 2009 results from Joshua Gates and his Destination Truth team are arguably even more compelling. A forensic expert examined the hair samples collected by Gates from a set of 13 by 10-inch footprints and found an entirely new and previously unidentified DNA sequence. To be honest, Everest is kind of scary. The reason being that it's fraught with peril and strewn with hundreds of lifeless bodies. Numerous icy corpses have made Everest their home. Is it, however, also where their souls rest? The answer is yes, according to Sherpa folklore. The Sherpas hold the belief that those who pass away in the mountains without a proper burial will spend eternity wandering as restless spirits. The locals in the mountains are so paranoid about the ghost population that they often assume that someone who is unusually tardy to return home has encountered one of these specters, who are believed to attack or possess the living. The Sherpas also dread being denied a proper burial and joining the damned if they die out in the wilderness alone. This could not be that far from the truth if the more bizarre reports of paranormal activity and ghost sightings in the Himalayas are any indication. There would be no shortage of these restless souls for a long time. The Himalayas have been a draw for the daredevil, luring those who are willing to risk all to conquer this untamed land, venture into the skies, and reach the nearly impossible summits. Tragically, a large number of individuals who venture into these icy regions never return to share their stories. The ascent of Mount Everest has claimed the lives of hundreds of people. Tragically, the majority of individuals who pass away here will never get a decent burial. Their corpses become frozen parts of the windswept landscape. Perhaps forever, climbers frequently encounter long-forgotten frozen remains in this desolate valley, particularly on Everest's northeast ridge. The colorful clothing worn by the deceased has earned this spooky high-altitude cemetery the moniker Rainbow Valley. Unfortunately, climbers rarely do anything for the abandoned bodies they come across. Sometimes they say a little prayer before continuing on into the mountains and risking their own deaths, leaving the body to rot in the cold. When Sherpas come across such bodies, they often execute a death rite to appease the spirits of the deceased. Explorers have long reported seeing clear supernatural occurrences here, which may not be surprising given the abundance of these corpses and the Sherpa folklore. Reports of spectral entities prowling the treacherous terrain are prevalent among those who have visited the Himalayas. In 2004, a Sherpa by the name of Pemba Dorje shared one such story from an Everest climbing expedition. He asserted that on his way to the peak, He discovered a number of bodies lying around in the snow, with one of them apparently still attached to a rope that was fixed to the rock face. According to the Sherpa, when he drew near the corpses, a horde of dark, shadowy figures materialized before him, pleading for humanitarian aid.